Greenleaf and the Black Blade, a serialized adventure podcast by Andrew Israelsen. The group rode forward for about 2 hours, picking their way carefully across the uneven ground. The trees that had dotted the landscape on their walk north from Amenia the past 2 days had thinned, the landscape grown sere and desolate. The air was very dry, despite the nearness of the sea, which was hidden now behind a line of low, jagged mountains to the east. The plains before Ellisbore were rocky and arid, with creosote and scrawbush hunching low over the silty soil. The group cut wide around the camp, approaching from the west, finally drawing up to a clump of juniper trees poised on a small crest. They hunkered down in the thin shade of its branches, peering towards the encampment, now only a half-mile ahead. What they saw was alarming, though unsurprising. There were several hundred orcs arrayed in a series of small camps along the base of the mountain. The camps themselves were little more than collections of animal skin huts, cook fires, and poorly dug trenches overflowing with orc waste. The monsters appeared to be waiting for something. There was much shouting and general milling about. Fights broke out here and there as they watched. They typically ended quickly, with a body being dragged toward the trenches. Tadalak let out a slow exhalation and said, "So many orcs."
"Perhaps they're guarding that,"
Nima said, pointing. Bruckner and Tadalak traced her finger to a large cavern at the base of Mount Ellisbore, past the line of the orc encampment. It was difficult to say with certainty, but it looked to be very deep. What they could see of the tunnel within was lit with some sort of white flame or fire.
"We need to get inside that cave. We should wait for nightfall,"
Nima said. The others agreed, Tadalak with a nervous gulp.
"We had better send the horses back the way we came. If we tie them up, they are like to be killed by some predator."
Tadalak looked at Bruckner excitedly.
"Tadalak was afraid this might happen, but we don't need to lose our horses forever. I know a charm that will help."
He pulled out a thin leather cord and muttered some words over it. It wriggled slightly in his palm, as if alive. Tadalak sliced it in two with a tiny dagger, then tied one of the cords to his pony's bridle and the other around his finger.
"I call this the finger string,"
he announced proudly.
"A charm of my own invention. The string, you see, it wants to go back together. It will always tug just a bit in the direction of its brothers. That'll lead us right to them."
They released the horses and Tadalak's pony, urging them south toward Thorn. Tadalak looked wistful as Justice Bringer trotted off, saying,
"Hopefully the three of them will stay together so we can find them all once we have finished here. Those big ones had better watch after Justice Bringer."
The three then settled in to wait for nightfall, taking turns dozing in the shade of the juniper trees as day wore into afternoon. Bruckner and Nima agreed to send Canary back to General Alexander with a message. Bruckner wrote swiftly in a tight, slanting hand.
"Traveling with gnome wizard, small but apparently useful, led us to town named Thorn. Information from drunken half-orc. King on way to Mount Ellisbore, possibly under influence of succubus. Strange, hooded figures also pursuing King. One, a swordswoman with facial tattoos. Base of mountains swarming with orcs. Trying to secure entrance to mountain stronghold. Send armed men. JB."
Nima sent Canary winging southward with whispered instructions to find General Alexander. At long last, the shadows were lengthening and the sun setting. As the day died, the orcs started growing louder and more boisterous. They were drinking, and by the time the sun had sunk, a full-on brawl had broken out in the middle of the camp. Nima gauged it the perfect opportunity. She stood abruptly and took a deep breath.
"I'll scout inside,"
she said simply. Tadalak leapt forward and gave her a tight hug around the waist, whispering,
"Be careful, little sister."
As he touched her, Nima felt a sort of shimmering about her that she could not explain.
"An enchantment of Vanderil for you. Armor of moonlight. Her beams will give you some protection against any orcs, if they see you."
Nima nodded in thanks and departed, slipping forward like a ghost in the darkness. She made steady progress, stepping silently along the pitted ground, soon coming to a campsite dominated by a roaring fire. A spit pig was roasting above it, being turned slowly by an orc who had recently lost several teeth. He was moaning drunkenly in pain, spitting blood onto the ground every few seconds. Nima counted 5 orcs talking drunkenly around the fire. She spied the feet of 2 others sticking out of a skin tent. Loud snores emanated from inside. She crept around the little camp slowly, keeping out of the firelight. Her footsteps went unheard over the roaring of the fire, the conversation of the brutes, and the brawl at the center of the camp ahead. Most of the other campfires had been deserted as the orcs had flocked to join the scrum that was now taking over the entire encampment. With all the commotion, Nima had no trouble making it past the cave entrance. The cavern inside was quite large and full of boxes, barrels, supplies, and armaments. A cylinder of white fire, clearly ensorcelled, burned in the center of the room, but gave off no heat. It fed on nothing that Nima could see, simply hovering a few inches off the slick rock floor of the cave. At the cavern's far end yawned a deep tunnel. It was lit with more of the curious white pillars of fire, the first about 50 feet in, the second another 150 beyond. Past the light of the second hex fire, the tunnel stretched back, further than Nima could make out. Breathing half a silent prayer, she chanced a venture into the tunnel. It led her subtly downward for some distance. It began to twist and turn slightly as she descended. Every few hundred feet, she came upon another of the cylindrical witchfires. Then, ahead, she spied an orc sentry sleeping next to one such light, his spear on the ground next to him. She hesitated. Then she turned and made her way with cautious haste back to where Bruckner and Tadalak waited. The fight was still raging outside. Nima caught a fire-rimmed glimpse of a pale orc kneeling to stick a dagger repeatedly through the throat of a downed foe. She turned just as the cackling wretch took a spear in the small of the back, and she traced a path along the darker edges of the night. Bruckner, meanwhile, was growing restless.
I want to know what we're dealing with here,
he said suddenly, rising to his feet.
Let's move a bit closer, see if we can hear or see anything.
Tadalak agreed, and the two began a slow descent down the hillside. As they made their way, Bruckner soon noticed two orcs walking drunkenly in their direction, one half tripping and falling onto the shoulder of his companion, who roughly shoved him off. They stopped a dozen yards away and began to relieve themselves onto a thalberry bush. They spoke roughly, their words just audible over the din of the fight.
Who do you think's gonna come out on top, huh? To Rush, for sure. That bastard can swing a morning star better than Skazbag himself. He'll shift that foaming fool, Grokbar. Huh. You better be wrong. Grokbar owes me money.
They finished their business and headed back, but after a few steps, one of them fell over, laughing, a hideous sound. The one still standing kicked at his fellow, cursing him. The fallen orc bellowed and said,
Oh, my head's pounding like that. When those bastards inside gonna finish their rotten ritual? When we get a burn Savar? Like I know, you shitstick. Get up, your head needs another drink. That'll stop it pounding. Come on.
He hauled his fellow up to his feet, and they trudged back to the camp. When the enemies were well away, Bruckner stood, making ready to continue, when Nima appeared suddenly out of the shadows behind them. Tadalak yelped at her sudden appearance, but slapped a hand over his mouth and gave her a thumbs up. Nima reported everything she had seen.
There's something happening within that cave. One doesn't post sentries for no reason.
You're right. 2 drunk orcs mentioned some ritual, and I have no doubts being carried on in that cavern. This rabble's invasion of Savar seems to hang on the ritual's completion. Is it likely we can get into the cavern undetected?
Nima hesitated, considering Bruckner's heavy tread and the image of Tadalak's hand slapped over his gasping mouth. Her silence stretched for a long moment.
I'm not sure. Perhaps Tadalak has a few helpful tricks up his sleeve?
Tadalak, who had apparently grown bored, was busy standing on one hand. At Nima's words, he rolled forward, ending up on his feet.
Tadalak can always help, but it could still be dangerous.
Is there anything specific you can do to keep us out of sight and sound?
Nima asked, with a touch of annoyance in her voice.
I'm afraid not, he said brightly. Phantasm isn't my forte, neither is eidetic magic, but I can make it so the enemies will have a harder time hitting you if they do see you. The moon has plenty to spare.
Whispering the incantation, Tadalak called upon Vanderil, beautiful and fey, the queen of the moon. The words were ornate and mysterious, and within them were contained ancient pleas uttered by neophytes of the White Lady since the moon was first shaken loose from the sun and began her own lonely course. She wove shivering bands about Bruckner as she had about Nima, and all at once the spell was done, and the eldritch shock of arcane forces coming into contact with the sluggish stuff of the sensible world was past.
But you will both have to protect Tadalak. It's best I don't wear the lady's silvery light myself. Too much moon interferes with my command of fire. I will stay behind you and cast strong magics if the orcs get too close. But stealth is probably best. Shall we head in?